You're listening to Unlocking Vulnerability, a podcast produced by Helen, helping you better understand consumer vulnerability.
Hello, I'm Helen and welcome to Unlocking Vulnerability. In this episode, I'm delighted to welcome my special guest, Nicki Osborne. Nicki is a fully rounded customer experience practitioner skilled in strategy, design, insight and delivery. Having spent 14 years in the utility sector, Nicki made the move to financial services around 2.5 years ago. She is now the Customer Experience Manager at M G Plc, an international savings and investment business with around 5 million retail customers. With her remit, she is responsible for setting the vulnerability strategy and delivering both tactical and strategic improvements across M&G's retail business. Hello, Nicki. It's wonderful to have you on my podcast today.
Hey Helen, it's great to be here.
So do you want to start by just giving us an introduction to yourself?
Yeah, of course. So hi everyone, I'm Nicki, and as Helen's mentioned, I'm a customer experience person. Spent about 10-12 years in CX, and that's been really diverse, ranging from implementing regulatory process improvements such as tariff changes, such as RMR back in 2012, I think it was 2012, right through to opening a retail store for an energy company on the high street. So that's been a really wide range of things that I've done in customer experience. But in terms of vulnerability, it's something that I've been dealing with now and working on for quite a long time, more than I realised. I looked into it a little while ago saying, when did I first do that? And I managed a vulnerable customer frontline team as one of my first ever management jobs back in 2009, 2010. So I've been involved with vulnerability now for over a decade, which is crazy really. And it's come full circle. So from a very frontline focused team to now leading the strategy and implementation across a PLC level organisation. It's come a long way, and I'm really excited about where we are.
So 11 years, I mean, you must have seen some real changes in sort of what regulators are expecting and what businesses are doing good practice wise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a huge shift in what vulnerability means. When I was first involved with it, in utilities, it's a collections environment primarily, really. I think you can't avoid that recognition that, it's about making sure people have supply and they can do what they need to do. But ultimately, they are organisations that need to make money. They're not charities. So whether if they're using something and they're not paying for it, we need to make sure we mitigate that risk and that commercial risk. And of course there are ways to manage that effectively, but I think the thing that I've seen shift over the last decades is the broadening of the definitions. I think that really helps. The huge recognition around mental health and the huge recognition of how things are interlinked. I think the intersectionality, if you want to use that phrase, of vulnerability, it has hugely stepped forward. And I think it's fantastic to see both societal and regulatory recognition for vulnerability.
Yeah, definitely. And I've been really encouraged over the last few years of the fast pace that we've seen. I think, especially across the financial services, I think they've been a real game changer for a lot of industries.
Absolutely.
So I know that you're leading the Vulnerable Customer Programme at M&G. Can you tell us more about the scope of that programme?
Yeah, of course. So as you mentioned, M&G is a large organisation, and with that comes a lot of complexity. M&G retail side is made up of a number of business units, and my role as the programme lead is to manage the coordination of all the implementation across those business areas. Each area is quite unique. They have their own product set, they have their own sort of operating areas, operating teams, their own stakeholders, their own sort of structures. Some are UK based, they're regulated through the FCA, some aren't. So that obviously brings another level of sort of angle of change and complexity. And so my role has been to determine what activities we want to do in terms of its full breadth really around vulnerability. So be that around frontline teams, propositional areas, process, culture, everything to do with vulnerability, to work out what we do and when, and to implement that right through to the full delivery.
Wow, a lot to think about really when you think about all vulnerability. I mean, just even looking at the FCA guidance, I class them as like 6 pillars because they're ultimately holding everything up. Just sort of taking each of those pillars individually. There is so much for an organisation to think about when they're looking at just each of those. And sort of going off tangent, I know, but you talk about sort of not every branch of the organisation is UK based. Are you using the UK FCA guidance as a benchmark for the other countries?
Yeah, absolutely. We're weighted more in the FCA domain, so that is definitely an element as to why. But I think speaking to colleagues and peers outside of our organisation and sort of people who are working in the vulnerability space, I hear that the FCA guidance is definitely seen in very good light, and I would agree. I think it is a very comprehensive document. You know, seeing it through its consultation and iteration, I think it's a great starting point for any organisation. I think the question is that enough? And then do you want to go more? That's a really helpful question to ask and a healthy question to ask. But yeah, absolutely. We're using that as our baseline and of course, making sure we comply with anyone's local regulations, and there's good conversation there around any sort of flexibility that's needed. But as a starting point, we use the FCA guidance.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree, because I've been having conversations with organisations in South Africa and Australia and New Zealand. And they are looking to the FCA guidance as sort of like, this is great practice, and this is what we should be striving for, because I think those countries are probably a good sort of 2 to 5 years behind where we're at already.
I think that's fair, and I think the UK is definitely doing some fantastic work. I think the British standard that's being developed is really promising. I was really pleased with that. I think it's very much in line with the FCA's guidance. I think it adds some colour to the FCA's guidance, which I welcome. I think, but the challenge with the FCA is that they obviously need to make sure it is generic enough and principle based enough that any organisation can turn their hand to it. The advantage the standards have is obviously they've got that ability to be a bit more specific and provide more examples. And I think that's fantastic. I think they go into what good training looks like and stuff like that. And so I'm really looking forward to that being published. It's not available yet. I've seen an early copy of it, which is fantastic. But I think that should hopefully be out next year. So I would encourage people to keep an eye out for that, because I think that would complement any work being done.
And that could be a future podcast episode as well, where we
absolutely
explore
that. Good one in the pipeline.
Yeah, definitely brilliant. So, I mean, we talked about the scope there, which is, absolutely huge, especially sort of knowing, where to start. And I think there's a really popular term, isn't there? Sort of eat the elephant is actually, a huge thing that you've got to achieve. Where do you actually start, and how do you break it down into those manageable chunks?
Yeah, it is. It's huge, isn't it? And I think you referenced there the FCA's 6 pillars, which is one way to break it up for sure. One of my mottos is keep it simple. I live by that motto, and this is no different. So I've gone even further with how I've viewed the guidance and broke it down to the classic systems, people, process sort of trifecta of how you can manage any big change. And that's what this is. It's a big change. So that's how the first angle, I think, to look at it. If we've developed a maturity matrix, or we're developing a maturity matrix that looks across those 3 angles, and that really helps to sort of say, let's just break it into those 3 sort of work streams, if you would. That also then asks the question around, so if you say systems, for me, that's things like infrastructure. So how are we recording vulnerability? How are we measuring the scale, the nature of vulnerability? And then how measuring outcomes, which is really, really important and often gets overlooked, I think. And then people, so processes, it's fixing things primarily, I think, in a lot of organisations that aren't startups. I think we've got to recognise many of us have been around for a long time, so a lot of stuff won't work as well as it should do for people in these circumstances. So really identifying those pain points and issues and fixing them. And then people, I think, is all around the appreciation that really vulnerability management should be BAU, and that means shifting culture. And so that's a lot of stuff. I would say the people strand is arguably the biggest strand of any vulnerability programme. Maybe not weighted initially, because I think that can base down the line, but it has to be a lot of effort in that space. And so within that, you've got making sure people have the right training and the right tools on an ongoing basis, and the right environments to work in, be that frontline or support functions as well. I can't overlook that it's not just frontline teams, something I'm really, really passionate about. It's got to be the whole organisation. So I think if you look through those 3 lenses, that really helps. And then the second piece I alluded to a minute ago is working out what's a must do versus a nice to do, so you can start to think about a sequence and order of things. So the FCA guidance obviously is a really good starting point for what you must do. There is a lot in there, so in breaking that down in terms of urgency is quite helpful. And then making sure we're clear about the other stuff that's not in the FCA guidance but is helpful to do, or what we'd like to aspire to do. And then it's about timing, so that we are focusing on the foundations that are really critical before we, spend a lot of time and money on maybe the innovative stuff that, while sounds great, isn't necessarily as urgent as some of the stuff that we should probably get on with.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you put a sort of out what you must do and then what is nice to have, because I think actually just thinking about the FCA guidance, there is a little bit prior to them going into the guidance, and they sort of say, there are some statements that are must statements, there are some statements that you should do, and then there's some other statements that actually are sort of, if there's time or if it's in your remit and your resources, then possibly do these as well. So they've kind of almost prioritized the order. So it's sort of working through, and which are the must statements, which are the should be doing statements. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good starting point. There isn't many must-dos, I think, in the FCA guidance.
No, I think it's about 5 or 6, isn't there?
Yeah,
really minimal.
And there is a lot of shoulds. And I think I did do an activity a while back where I literally copy and pasted all the shoulds out. And there's a bit of duplication in there, naturally. But there's a lot more than I think people realise. So splitting that out, and then also the examples, and not getting, I think, put off by some of the examples. Examples are fantastic, but a lot of them are more mature, I would say. So, I think that clear sequence and order of activity is really, really important. Don't put off doing the big things. Some of them take longer to do, but don't stop doing those smaller tactical foundational improvements that ultimately are, the bedrock of good improvement. So yeah, that's good advice, I think.
Yes, and then that just reminds me of sort of a really good analogy, because I did go ape yesterday with my youngest son. I took him out for the day, and I was sort of completely out my comfort zone, and sort of looking across each of the assault courses. You go from sort of tree to tree. I'm not sure if you're familiar with go ape. So you go from tree to tree, sort of really high up above the ground. And I was like well out of my comfort zone, and I just thought I can't focus on the next tree because it's too far away and I'm going to feel too overwhelmed. So I just have to focus on where my feet are going for the next section, if the next plank of wood or the next rope or the next piece of zip wire or whatever it is, And I think that's almost what businesses need to do. Sometimes we can become overwhelmed because actually this is what we should be achieving. But actually we kind of just sort of think, whoa, it's too overwhelming and I don't know where to start. So again, it is by putting it down into those manageable chunks that you can think, okay, I'm just going to focus on what I can do right now, and then I'll move to the next step. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is exactly what firms need to really try and do. If they are doing these big scale vulnerability programs, I think it's really helpful to have clarity on the end goal. That helps with alignment. But I do think don't focus too much on the plan for 2, 3, 5 years ahead, because there is so much to do. I think you're absolutely right. Focus on the next plank of wood, and just do the next one after that and the next one after that. And every now and again, check in on that mid to long term plan and make sure it's about right. But yeah, I think it's helpful just to focus on the shorter term plan. Once you have that longer term plan sort of set in stone, a bit clearer, because that's when you can really start to make change and get on and do stuff. That's the important thing. I think if you're not careful, you'll spend months just spending time on planning. And one of my other phrases I like to use is less talk, more do, and just crack on and do things. And I think that's really, really helpful. And we did that with our program. We officially stood up December, January of last year, this year. And we didn't want to spend months planning. So we just took the FCA's 15 firm should statements in their image that they have in the guidance. And we just did a very rapid assessment to say, where are we today? Where are the gaps? And let's crack on with those things. And then after that, we then looked at, doing a further deeper planning piece. But doing that short, rapid assessment enabled us to crack on immediately and get out of the starting gate by February, which I think if we had tried to do a full assessment, we would have been probably now just starting. So we've been 6 months behind.
Yeah. You've also mentioned that within the programme, there are many different business units, each with their own stakeholders, operating models and agendas. So how do you align all of these different areas together sort of under one strategy as such?
Yeah, that is, of course, a challenge. So I think the good thing is it's regulated to most of it. So there's an appreciation and a recognition that we've got to do something. So I think the biggest alignment challenge is not the should we do something? It's the what should we do and how, and that's always a good starting point, rather than just trying to corral appreciation and momentum. So there's already a good starting line. For us, we've worked on a very collaborative basis. So whilst I'm the lead, the team have got a remote team of people for each business area. So we bring those ventures together, those business areas together, and for each initiative, I ask, what are you doing at the moment? And that will range from very mature, with some tweaks to get better, through to nothing. And then we have a good, debate around the strengths and weaknesses of all those current working practices. And then also I tend to try and bring in, an external view, an outside-in view. So I think the thing that I find wonderful about the topic of vulnerability is how open as an industry we are about it. It's so refreshing. So, whether it's podcasts like yourself, Helen, whether it's other networking groups and trade body groups, but equally just like keeping abreast of white papers and best practice, trying to bring that in, and charitable views and organisations to sort of challenge, not just looking inside about, how can we align, but also how can we improve. And that really helps. And yeah, some of the debates have been really interesting. We've talked about data policy a lot. So that was one of our first activities. We brought colleagues from all the different business units together, all our compliance teams together, our data policy teams, which international data policy teams is always interesting to get together. And then had a number of 180 decisions that we debated and got to a final place. We were very happy. But I think that candid, honest collaboration has been the crux of how we can align.
Yes, yeah. And I know you're part of the collaboration network as well that I'm involved with Will and Mark. So, and the discussions there have been amazing. And actually it's amazing how many of those conversations do ultimately get back to the data and how we get that data, how we record it, how we use it for the best interest of the customer. So
yeah, I think the collaboration network is a fantastic one for sure. I've got a lot of value from the networking there, and the team there are just genuinely, everyone wants to help each other get better, which is fantastic. And yeah, I think interestingly, so data policy was one of our first initiatives that we started on. I think we saw it, again, just thinking about that sequence and order. That was part of the conversation that we had around what should we do when. We realised that was probably an enabler to a few things. The conversation around measuring scale and nature can't really be had until we work out what we want to do with data to start with. Equally, some of the servicing improvements you might want to do might rely on certain data being in systems or CRMs, and if our policy wasn't going to be that direction, then we might have to unpick some of that work. So we started with data policy purposefully for that reason. And I think it's interesting. I think a lot of firms, we've landed on a position where we're capturing additional needs really, rather than the labels of vulnerability. And I think that's the message I hear a lot now echoed around our industry, is that this isn't about labeling people, it's about understanding what we can do to help them get what they need better and easier. And that's definitely been our direction of travel. And that will change now how we do other activities. So scale and nature, for example, how do you do that if you're not capturing all the drivers? Is a really interesting challenge that we're going to try and overcome over the next few months. And I think the FCA have given some guidance in that space, which supports that direction of travel and thinking, which is I'm glad about. I think starting with policy is a good foundation as well.
Yeah, fantastic. So going back to your vulnerability program, then what do you think makes up a good customer vulnerability program then? So what top tips can you give other people who are listening to this?
Being rounded is probably something I'm really passionate and advocate. I think there's been a lot of best practice and good endeavours in days gone by, and that's been very frontline focused. So as I mentioned, I've been in vulnerability world for over a decade, and when you work with frontline teams, it's very rare, I think, you come across somebody who purposefully tries to cause a customer anxiety or pain or just a worsening experience. They're very much trying to do the best. So operationally, I think people have reacted to vulnerability the best they can for a long time. So I think the need for firms is to think broader, to think more rounded. And so whether it's the 6 pillars or the 3 sort of work streams, or however people want to chunk it up, I think it's really, really important to not just look at how frontline teams identify and respond to vulnerability. And I think that's I use the word reactive. I think we've got to be much more proactive. And I think for me, that means the infrastructure, making sure we understand the topic well, not to the point of death by MI, but I think to have a good understanding of your customer base. But then to design with vulnerability in mind, to do that inclusive design piece, and to ensure that as you're doing, process improvements or creating new propositions and products, that you are considering the top types of vulnerabilities in your base, and ultimately not just saying, oh, a customer has X as a driver, but what might that mean for that customer? How does that manifest? How might that change the experience for them? And ultimately, what harm could they face? I think that's a conversation we've got to focus on. And then the culture piece, doing something once and landing a change and saying, I've done some training is one thing. Making it stick, making it sustainable, and walking away from it and coming back to a change 2-3 years later, and that environment still being vulnerability minded, for want of a better phrase, that's the measure of success for me. And that is a wonderful feeling, and it can be done. We did some change in one of our call centres there, and I walked away and went to a different project for a few years, and I came back and they were still using the tools that I had rolled out maybe 3 to 5 years later, and that it was really fantastic to see. So it can be done, but it takes a lot of effort. It takes a huge amount of effort, and it needs to make sure the environment and the leadership is backing that. Otherwise, it won't land, because the next big change will happen and something will come in its place. So I think roundedness and sustainability would be my 2 words that I would recommend anyone to focus on.
Brilliant. And it's interesting that you say about sort of be vulnerability minded, because that's what I talk about sort of in my training courses. Actually, we're wanting to build this vulnerability mindset, actually, not just in the frontline staff who attend the training, but also sort of in the organisation, that every single person in that organisation and the organisation as a whole has this right mindset that actually we want to do what's right for our customers, not just because the regulator said we have to and it's a tick box exercise, but actually it's the morally it's the right thing to do, and it is going to help sustainability of the organisations. Actually, I
think it's easier to achieve the FCA guidance if you shift the mindset, ironically. And I think shifting support functions, however you want to call them, I like to use support functions. I know different teams have different ways of wording it, but I think helping those colleagues understand what does vulnerability really mean is a challenge. So one of the things that we're working on at the moment is personas, and rather than very traditional marketing-led propositional personas, we've spent a lot of time articulating. We've identified firstly what are our top vulnerability drivers, and that's not too difficult to do. I think you can do that without too much science and data. I think people get worried sometimes to start a rough feel, start somewhere, and you can always iterate and improve. So we've taken our top 6. And we've used that and gone, okay, let's create 3 vulnerable customers. A phrase I'm not really a fan of, but we'll use it for the sake of the conversation. And that
could be another topic of conversation.
Know,
right? Another
exactly.
podcast.
Yeah, we'll take some customers with certain situations, and then okay, so if this customer is someone who isn't digitally savvy and also is struggling with some financial situations at the moment, what would that mean for him, and how does it manifest? And let's talk about his background. Does he have a family around him? Does he not have a family around him? And those sorts of things. Is he quite introverted or extroverted? Is he quite independent, or does he like to have people to help him make decisions? The great thing about that is that we can then say, what are the harms that can arise for people in these circumstances, whether it's accessibility issues because of that lack of digital skills, or whether it is those poor financial decisions, either through urgency or a lack of awareness for somebody who is facing financial hardship or financial difficulties. And I think it is helping colleagues to connect the dots is a really important thing that we can't lose sight of. For all those non-operational guys, I think the thing that I often see, and we're getting a lot better at it, and the program's really helped us move forward in this space, but it is that phrase of the vulnerable customer and this grouping of it. It's one person, and that's not helpful. That's really not helpful at all. But even if it's just 3 people, I think it can make a huge difference. I think if you can make those people real and articulate and bring a story to those people, I mean, it's fantastic if you can use them on real data. I mean, that's like nirvana at this stage. But you can do it just on a bit of desk research and a bit of information about your base. And then you can start to have a conversation. Well, if it's Joan and Joan has X and Y, those vulnerability drivers can lead to these behaviours, which might lead to these harms. And then you can play that into, right, okay, we're going to create a new digital service. What's that mean for her? or if we're going to change the timing of a letter, what does that mean to her? And I think it is that just additional resourcing prompt to give people that additional resource of a prompt, should I say, that can really help people bring it to life.
Yes. So in effect then, at some of your meetings, you've got additional 3 chairs at the table, because ultimately you're sort of turning to a blank chair and sort of, okay, Joan, how does this work for you? What are your thoughts on this? You know, what's the best plan of action for you?
Yeah, it's exactly that. It is that bringing the customer into the room piece. I think making it real. I think that is, the customer chair. I love that analogy. And in physical, you can do it sometimes, can't you, as well? I've seen it with props sometimes. That works beautifully. I've seen a walking stick brought in for a customer, or a newspaper or something like that in previous projects that I've worked on. But yeah, we've just done it because of remote working for a reason. Just created some digital sort of materials, and that's gone a long way. We're looking at how we can expand that through sort of internal comms and cultural activities. But just to start with, just get the ball rolling, start small and build and iterate. We've just gone with some little PowerPoint based personas, and we'll sharpen them and make them better, but start somewhere. I think that's the important bit. I heard a phrase yesterday on an advert, which was, you don't have to be amazing to start, you just have to start to be amazing. And I loved it. I thought it was such a great little quote. So yeah, I think it's that in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I love your idea of Joe sort of sitting around the table, being part of the discussions. I mean, you've covered so much about what the program entails and sort of all the hard work that you've put in and all the research and that. What's been your biggest challenges since you've started the program?
Yeah, it's a good question to ask anyone with big project like this. I think it's a classic. I think it's resource. So I think, we've talked about how big this activity is. It touches not only a big area of a business, the complexity of the size, but equally the complexity of the what needs to change. And there's only so much capacity within a business to make change. So working out what we want to do and our sequence in order as a program, and then overlaying that with all the other stuff that's happening in the business. We're not the only program, we're quite a small program really compared to some of the stuff we're working on. So making sure that we have the subject matter experts in certain conversations that we need them to be in, and making sure that we can land those improvements, getting time for, whether it's IT teams or, frontline teams, whatever it might be, compliance teams even, to help us and make sure we are doing the right thing and we can deliver it. Resource, I think, is classically the big challenge. But I think the way that's overcome is through great backing. So we have established a great exec sort of management group that helps us with our program. We've been running now for about 6 months. We meet every month, and that's supported at a very senior level, and we share progress against the plan. So right from the start, we did that first iteration of a plan based on those 15 statements. We will review that plan as we do this maturity assessment that we're working on now, and I'm sure that plan will explode on the back of that, but I'm very excited about that. But the great thing about that management group is we also talk about risks and issues. So that is the way we overcome those challenges, and then we can have a healthy conversation, a rounded conversation with the relevant senior management around how important is this versus other activities. And as always in business, it is a compromise and a balance. We can't just win every argument, but it does help. It definitely helps to have the senior backing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, and that's again, it comes into the FCA guidance, is that they've put a huge amount of weight just from the consultation paper from last year into the actual final guidance, that there's a real weight on the senior leadership, isn't there? I don't know if you noticed that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it has to be there. I think, we've mentioned the word culture a lot in this conversation, and I think culture, it can come from the bottom, but I think to stick, I think it has to come from the top. And I think because ultimately we do what we're measured on as individuals in business, and if measurements change, if directions of travel change, then what we do and how we do it will change. So for me, senior management who set the strategy, the objectives of people and how they want to work, they've got to be engaged. They've got to be leading the dialogue, leading the conversation, and not just talking the talk. I think that's the other thing as well. I think, as you mentioned, people are talking around vulnerability a lot, but what are people actually doing? I think that's the really important thing. I I heard the phrase vulnerability washing the other day, which I thought was like,
I've not heard that.
You know what, there is a bit of that around, where people are sort of having this veneer of we're doing stuff, but actually what are you doing? What is a tangible improvement to your end consumers and customers or clients or whatever your base will be? What can they see differently today than they did 6 months ago? And that's, I think, the important thing. So not just saying, you know, to the FCA or industry parties that, yes, we're taking it very seriously, but actually doing something about it. That's the important thing.
And also, again, it helps with that sustainability of the organisation, because if it is led from the top down, it's part of the culture, it's part of the behaviour. When you do recruit new members of teams, this is how we do things around here. This is how we support our customers. This is how we step outside of, you know, the norm and the process to help our customers who need additional support. This is our mindset. This is how we show we care. So all of these things are going to help that organisation to be more sustainable as the future comes.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I think, you know, businesses constantly evolve, whether it is, you know, the senior management or people doing the do, you know, whether that's frontline teams or support functions. You know, there's always churn of people, and you're absolutely nailed on the head there. You know, if it's not part of the induction, if it's not part of the culture and objectives, then it will just fade away over time.
Yeah, definitely. So I know that you've mentioned a couple of top tips there for the listeners. So are there any other further advice that you want to give someone who is sort of thinking, do you know what, actually we've sat on the guidance for 6 months, you know, we really do need to start implementing it? What other sort of advice would you give those listeners?
I think start small. So I think we've talked a lot about the size of the activities here. There is a lot to be done, and that cannot be denied. But there is that, you know, that snowball momentum that can be built, and that's how we started. We started quite small, and we got a flavour for what could be done and how it can be done, and we'll build momentum, and we'll grow, and we'll do more. So my suggestion would be to work out, you know, through looking at the data, looking at the guidance, you know, what's important to you as an organisation. And it might be actually, you know, you do want to focus on one element of those work streams. You do want to focus on systems, perhaps, or you want to focus on culture first, whatever it is. I think process improvement is a great place to start. I think it's very tangible for customers, and that makes the real difference. The other stuff is important, absolutely. But in terms of starting small, I'd encourage to start in process and then start making some change. Like, just get on and do something. I think, you know, if you're not careful, as we talked about, you know, you'll end up spending months just debating which bit of the project should we start on. But just get on and crack on and do something. And if it needs to tweak or reiterate in the future, then fine. But yeah, start small and grow from there.
Fantastic tips there. Thank you very much, Nicki. So, I mean, that really sort of brings to the end all the questions that I wanted to ask you, and it's been absolutely fantastic for you to share the programme and everything around that. Is there any final thoughts you'd like to share before we sort of bring the episode to a close?
The foundation of it all for me is about real people. I think we touched on it, right, with this whole the vulnerable customer and personas and stuff like that. But one thing we haven't really talked about today, which I know you've talked about in previous podcasts, is real customers and bringing them in where you can. And so whether it is through real customers or whether it is through sort of amalgamation and assimilation of existing research, just don't forget to bring the voice of the consumer and the customer in. And I think that really helps to challenge and overcome some misnomers as well. So I think there was some really interesting things that I've seen around the data piece was really interesting. There was a report done by Barclays, I think it was, a few years ago, on the use of data for vulnerable customers. And actually, people with needs don't mind you capturing their data because it helps them capturing their data. And it was like, wow, that's okay. It was kind of like a shocking moment at the time. I think people were like, okay, it's okay to capture some information. And so I think because I'd asked real customers about their perception of this, it kind of like broke the misconception that capturing any data was inappropriate. And similarly, you know, I know you do a lot of work in sort of customers in crisis space, the misnomer of talking about suicide. If you're dealing with a customer who's suicidal, you know, actually when people have spoken to customers and researched those who have gone through that crisis moment, the benefit of being explicit far outweighs the risk of anything else. So I think doing the research, whether that is through your own customer base or using, you know, the huge array of information that's already out there, or working with someone like yourself, Helen, you know, if you want to pull the gaps in, then yeah, I think firms can just bring real voices into the conversation.
Fantastic, thank you. And ultimately that that real customer is ultimately who we're looking to support at the end anyway.
Yeah, these are about real people. It's real people. It's not take the out of vulnerable customer. Let's do a strap line. It's not the vulnerable customer. Let's just call it consumer vulnerability.
Exactly. Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Nicki, for your time today. It's been absolutely fantastic for you to share all your thoughts and what your program is looking to achieve. Absolutely fantastic. So we wish you all the best with that. And I'd love to hear how it progresses as well, and how you change and how it develops over the next coming sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unlocking Vulnerability. Please take care of yourself and stay safe and well. Remember to subscribe to my podcast and leave a review. And you can also follow me on Twitter @HPettiferTrain. And I look forward to you joining me on my next episode.